They said she was air in absence, dressed in silk. In the crowd of lantern light and perfumed laughter, Lin Sanqi stood where no one had to look twice, behind the fold of a decorated screen, by the kitchen door, trailing the hem of some great lady's robe. Fireworks stitched the night sky in bright impatience. They burst and fell like broken promises. A spark hissed, a scrap of color fizzed, and then sputtered out before the crowd could applaud. On the edge of the banquet, Sanqi watched the failed flare reflect in a pool of lacquer at her feet. She thought, not aloud but as though it were the only true language left to her, "They call me nothing. They will remember me, but not for what I have done." There was a small, private heat to that thought, sharp, almost mischievous. It did not seek revenge. It did not crave crowns. It was the calculation of someone who had learned, through hunger and slaps and tired nights sewing the hems of other people's fortunes, how to turn being overlooked into an advantage. If no one saw what you were, you could see everything else. The wedding at General El Shengyan's house was meant to announce alliances, to show soldiers in bright armor, and wives in carefully measured beauty. It was every kind of vanity laid out, with sauce and song. Outside, wagons had come from ruined villages with bundles of refugees, who had been promised shelter, and found instead the indifferent hospitality of war. Inside, courtiers stepped over their needs, with the practiced gait of those raised on marble. Lin Sanqi had spent that afternoon among the poor, slipping them bowls stolen from the kitchen, tucking a ribboned bread into the fist of a child. Small mercies, hidden things. She loved them the way some people loved prayer without anyone else knowing. Her stepsister Teresa was not her name, but a name like that would have fit the way she wore. Her silk approached, with a braid of perfumed jasmine and all the sharp angles of a woman who had practiced the art of being seen. "Sanqi?" she said, that single syllable, a test. Sanqi offered a curt, polite smile. The step family's approval was an iron foundry. Intermittent and expensive, she had learned to nod like a bell. The first sign that the night would not be ordinary was subtle. A tray of spiced wine. Kind old men liked to toast, with topped the table, its lacquer rim glinting. A page missed. A cup slid and caught the sleeve of a visiting commander. The commander laughed. Someone near the head table coughed, then laughed when a woman leaned in and fanned him. A boy in the crowd, riven with fever and hunger, noted nothing but the lanterns. Then the captain of the guard made the strangled sound of a man whose throat is burning from the inside. A handful of guests bent to the floor, eyes blown wide, limbs gone soft. A servant had been sent to fetch water, and returned with no hands on the bucket. The well was far, and the crowd was suddenly a sea of pallid faces. It was an old trick poison slipped into the cup of a man whose one sin was too much power and very little conscience. In the next heartbeat someone jerked a sleeve to their mouth and sucked until there was no more blood. The air filled with a new kind of quiet. Sanqi was the first to move because she had nothing that kept her in place at that table. She pressed through the riot of silk, and shouted to a kitchen boy for herbs. The kitchen boy's palms trembled. He could not find the right jar. Sanqi's fingers were steady. She had watched an old village healer when she was a child watched. How the woman smelled a leaf and turned it between her thumb and forefinger. How she wrapped bark in marsh and tied it with thread until the fever leached. Night by patient night, the memory sat inside Sanqi, like a small stone. Cool, useful. She tore a scrap from her sleeve and, trembling with the cold thrill of doing something no one expected, cupped it and leapt above a table to reach a man convulsing on the boards. Her hands were small. They moved like instructions. She understood poisons the way some people speak family names. There was a smell she recognized, a bitter peel mixed with the metallic stench of ash. She chewed leaves until her jaw burned, and pressed them into the lip of the wounded man. He spat and groaned and clutched at her wrist, like a child. She felt, absurdly, the tickle of recognition. The man had once saved the life of a dog in a border hamlet, and now, for that small debt, Fate had turned to ask something of her. Somewhere on the periphery, two figures watched with their faces half hidden by shadow. One wore the long, tight coat of an inspector newly returned from the province's Lin Sanqi. He had a reputation as a man who measured truth, not rumor. With the same rationed care he used to weigh coins, his brow, when it knitted, looked like he was balancing two truths at once, and finding both heavier than he expected. The other was a prince, young, tall, and given to standing slightly apart, as if he wanted to be both part of the spectacle and outside it. He watched, not with the curious distance of a man amused, but with the careful observation of someone who writes notes about the heart. There was in him a patience that was not weakness, and an authority that was still learning itself. When Lin Sanqi came closer, it was because he had to know the cause before making any judgment. Precision kept him from being fooled. He watched Sanqi work, and saw how the way her mouth pursed when she searched the herbs was the same manner in which a scholar underlined a key line. He noted a sachet at her neck, small, worn, a faded silk pouch stitched with the same shoulder knot as a midwife's token. He made mental notes. This one had a history. The prince watched more than he spoke. He watched the curl of Sanqi's jaw, the way she did not flinch when a man vomited at her feet. He saw the scar the kitchen lad bore across his temple and, because the prince was not entirely made of court prudence, felt a cold ember of compassion. He had been a child once, hidden under a bedstead during a riot, fingers sticky with starch and fear. There are things that never leave men of power. The specific texture of hunger, the way a voice can sound in the dark. Sanqi's hands made him remember. That night, as the banquet unraveled into a scene of hurried prayers and whispered accusations, someone dropped a name, an old soldier, who owed a debt named the Prime Minister's son, Pan Yang. Pan Yang moved through life, like a man with a permanent appetite. He smiled as if the world belonged to him, and where he smiled he took. He had reasons to see General L undermined. Every palace is a web of debts and loans, and Pan Yang had been the lender. Blame slid toward him like oil. He denied with a practiced tilt of chin. Accusation needed a scapegoat. A servant slipped something, someone said. A kitchen hand. Eyes turned as if magnets pulled them. Teresa's smile sharpened into a blade. She stepped forward and, with the cruelty that has the same root as fear, let her voice carry. It was the stepdaughter, Lin Sanqi. She was seen near the cups. Heads turned. The room, which had been thick with smoke and fear, cooled into a calculated quiet. Sanqi felt it, like a hand on the base of her skull. She had been vilified by thinner things. A lowered glance, a missed bow. This was different. It sought to make her nothing by law and by literature. To be accused in public was to be written out of the story as easily as touching a blot to fresh ink. Lin Sanqi stepped forward. Was she seen? He asked. He did not ask as one who believed nothing. He asked as one who was building an argument. Name the witnesses. No witnesses, answered Pan Yang. With the smoothness of a man whose words had been bought or practiced, he flicked his fan like a judge. Only the servants whispering. And you know how servants love their stories. The prince listened. He had inherited from his tutors the art of weighing spectacle. He also understood when a man made an accusation to cover his own shame. His eyes flicked to Sanqi, to the sachet at her throat, to the faint crescent of a pale birthmark beneath her ear nape. As a river stone, there was something about her that refused to be entirely explained by her station. He found himself inclined to protect small things. He was not blind to the politics. He held no desire to torpedo his own court at the first sign of any's but. There are decisions made not for the throne but for the heart, and he felt in his chest the first stirrings of such a choice. Sanqi did not protest. She had learned the slow art of survival. She let them speak her name, as though echo. Her thoughts moved like a contraband. They will remember the way I helped while they forgot their own hands, she thought, If no one cares to look closer, I will keep tending what hurts. That thought was a secret, because it was not pride but a plan. The kind that grows from the small humiliations of being unattended. The first CTA should fall here. Soft as a drawer closing. If you love palace twists and hidden truths, hit subscribe. There are more nights where lantern light reveals what people try to hide. After the accusing words, the magistrate called for a preliminary hearing. Lin Sanqi, now more interested than ever, insisted the accused be treated fairly. He had a way of folding justice in at the corners like a careful garment. Blunt where needed, elegant where possible. He ordered the kitchen sealed, witnesses kept in the room, until their names were recorded. Pan Yang's smile narrowed. He had a hunger beneath his tongue that looked predatory in a place where men wore good manners. Like cloaks, as the crowd dispersed into disgruntled whispers, two small events occurred that would later become like threads for a tapestry nobody could see in full yet. First, a midwife folded and Suncrack sidled to Sanqi and slipped into her palm a tiny embroidered token. It was a scrap of blue silk, fraying at the edges. For when you forget who you are, the woman murmured, so low that no one but Sanqi heard. The token smelled faintly of river reeds and charcoal. Sanqi's fingers closed around it like a child holding a secret. The second event was simpler and more careless. Pan Yang, moving too close while smiling, brushed Sanqi's arm. His hand lingered a moment that was long enough to make Sanqi's skin crawl. There was no alley, no whispered insult, only the sense that some men believed the world was a place to take from. She moved away, pulling the token within the folds of her shirt, her palm pressing the silk into the place over her heart where, if anyone had been paying attention, a pale birthmark might have been seen. She kept her head down, and walked as if the night were nothing more than another march. Days later, when the magistrate summoned Lin Sanqi to the lower chambers, the room smelled of oil and old wood. Lantern light fell on faces like judgment. Lin Sanqi stood to the side, his hands folded in consideration. He had investigated nothing and everything in the week since the banquet. He had questioned the kitchen boy, until the boy nearly fainted. He had seen the ledger where a line of bribes was written in a hand almost identical to a young man's in the Prime Minister's household. He had watched Pan Yang buy wine, for men who had no shortage of coin but an excess of motive. It was not enough to convict, but it was enough to persuade. You worked in the kitchens? The magistrate asked, not accusatory but with the formal, thin patience of someone who collects small confessions like a jeweler collects stones. Yes, Sanqi said. Her voice was steady, steadier than the magistrate expected. I fetched water. I brought bowls to the refugees. I was near the tables. Did you touch the cup? The question was the net meant to catch. No, she replied. She was not lying. She had not touched the cup with poison. She had handled other cups. The law wanted clean violences, states and poisons and people to name and punish. It did not like gray patches, where guilty and innocent overlapped. Across the room, a whisper traveled. The midwife's token? Someone said. Everyone knows of the mark. Lin Sanqi moved, not with speed, but with certainty. He produced a simple, folded piece of cloth from his sleeve and unrolled it. On it lay a scrap of paper, with a line of ink and a sketch. The sketch was not grand. A small crescent curved beneath a woman's jaw. A witness says the hand that bribed the kitchen lads had a habit, he explained. A slip of a stitch. This connects ledgers, not people. You cannot condemn a woman for the look of a stitch. It was a procedural thing, connecting the ledger to Pan Yang's clerk. It was not heroic, but it was necessary. The magistrate frowned. Pan Yang's face darkened. The court quieted, as if waiting for a storm. Sanqi listened to the talk of ledgers, and witnessed how men traded other men's freedom like hares. She heard, in the pauses between official words, the temptation to blot her out. Her inner thought, which she kept like a hot coal, said. They call me nothing. That's why I can touch the wound no one else will touch. When it became clear that no immediate execution would come, because the prince had quietly sent word he wanted to observe the case and the magistrate feared moving without the court's eye, Sanqi was escorted back to the quarters where the step-family kept her. The house smelled of oil lamps and the sourness of too much ambition. Her stepsister watched her like a hawk. You walked straight into that. Teresa spat once the door had shut. You bring shame to our name by your insolence. Sanqi's answer was not to her step-family, but to herself. She thought of the refugees with hollowed eyes. She thought of the old midwife's fingers, like tree roots, and of the token. She thought of the prince's quiet watching, and of Lin Zhongyi's careful notes. In a country that adores spectacle, these tiny attentions felt like an altar built in the dark. Word traveled through the capital faster than a gull. Pan Yang, not idle, turned his attention into a weapon more private and vicious than public accusation. He began the sort of small cruelties that are the prelude to larger ones. A servant's insult, a gift too heavy and too late, a whispered suggestion that a woman without true name might be more useful behind closed doors. His predator's manner elevated him among a certain set. Among others, it made him a man, to be inspected. Lin Zhongyi watched him with a distaste that was almost physical. He had, in the 3 months since his appointment, seen the rot that money paints on men. He had been an inspector once who broke chains, and then had to let some fall back into place. That memory of failure sharpened his current compass. For Sanqi, the small cruelties were like raindrops on stone persistently wearing. Pan Yang's attention became a shadow at the edge of every festival. He would stand in the doorway of a hall and make the room feel like an offering to his appetite. When he touched a hand, it was to mark it, as one might brand sheep. Once, in the crowded dusk of a market, he placed a small parcel at her feet, an ornate fan with an ivory hinge. For a pretty hand, he said smoothly. And the merchants around them smiled as a man smiles at a play. Sanqi picked up the fan and set it, unopened, upon a stall. She refused to be the foil to his appetite. There was a rumor silence dressed as gossip that, if a woman refused a powerful man, she lost more than esteem. Her standing, her prospects, the livelihood of those she tended, could all be diminished by a man's displeasure. Sanqi knew this. She knew the calculus of power, and so she kept silence, like a shield. That winter, refugees kept arriving on the edges of the city like a tide. Then Sanqi found them wherever she could, her sleeves still smelling of the night's fumes. She began to do something that men called radical in small, private ways. She taught other women how to find the borderline herbs that slowed fevers, how to boil broth that would keep children from wasting. She sewed pockets into coats, so that bread would not be mislaid at market. A woman who can teach another woman how to keep a child alive quietly breaks kingdoms apart. It is not as dramatic as a sword, but more dangerous. In the palace, the prince noticed threads connecting the streets, sorrow to his court's indifference. He began to pull. A child had died in a lane near the palace wall last month. The prince had heard about the child and accepted the official explanation that provided no inconvenience. Now, having noticed the same men, the small, busy woman who moved like a quiet storm, he felt the shame of small duties unmet. He had young advisors who argued the state by procedure. He had older men who preferred images for their comforts. He had, lately, been learning to listen to patterns, how quiet hands study the world, how a small, merciful practice can become a policy. It was Lin Zhongyi who brought the prince a report not yet filed. There are missing payments of granaries, Your Highness. Men who should have protected the towns have been paid to look away. Lin Zhongyi's voice was steady. There are refugees bearing gifts of stories, and not of coin. The famine is not a failure of heaven, it is a failure of men. The prince read the lines and, for the first time in his life, felt how a small omission could look like a tapestry when placed beside others. He asked quietly, "Who tends the edges, the ones we ignore?" Lin Sanqi answered, "A woman named Lin Sanqi. Tends them in her spare hours." That sentence should have been a line on a ledger. Instead, it moved like a hand across the prince's chest. Whether by destiny or curiosity, he began to watch for She, for her part, was unaware of the new attention, save for a single small thing. One evening, as she worked in the alley where the refugees slept under patched tarpaulins, a soldier came by one of the prince's retinue. He dropped a wrapped parcel at her feet and walked away. Without looking back, the parcel contained plain black tea and a folded piece of red paper with the prince's seal, folded so modestly it could have been a love note between two people who had no circumstances for romance. It read not more than a few words. "For those who keep the city breathing." There was no signature, only the prince's mark. Sanqi read the words, too. She felt, for a breath, an affection that was not warrant. She put the tea away and stirred a vat of soup. She did not know whether the prince intended to do anything more than offer a small kindness. Court kindnesses often go no further than that. Still, the gesture mattered. It was proof in a world that looks for proofs. Weeks later, the rumor of the banquet's poison returned, braided now with the whisper that the prince had noticed a woman in the crowd with the midwife's token at her throat. Pan Yang's teeth clicked in annoyance. He would not be undermined by a woman in patched sleeves, who slipped herbs into the mouths of the wounded. His plan deepened into a more vicious calculation. Better to control her than to be controlled by the embarrassment she presented. He began to seed stories that she had, on occasion, been seen in private with soldiers, that she made impossible requests for grain, that she laughed too loudly at tomb rituals. The court was small enough that stories grow like mildew, slow, insidious. Soon, a murmur reached the chamber of the prince that suggested Sanqi might be a troublemaker who needed to be watched. The prince, who had an interest in hiding small rebellions in plain sight, and thus testing them, instructed quietly that she be left alone for the time being. It was a dangerous form of attention. To be spared for observation is sometimes worse than immediate punishment. The winter continued, stern and honest. Sanqi continued to stitch coats and teach mothers to stir broth. She dreamed, in private, of things that would derange polite conversation. She imagined telling the prince the truth of the refugees, of the ledgers that proved bribery, of the midwife's token and what it might mean. She imagined herself standing tall and being seen for what she had always been in the dark. A woman whose hands could steady. One night, while the moon was thin and the streets smelled of cold ash, Lin Sanqi sought her out in the refugee quarter. He found her where she always was, by a brazier, giving a child a sip of water she had boiled. He could have ordered her to cease and desist. He could have arrested, protected, commanded. Instead, he sat, boots on the dirt, and asked questions like a man gathering leaves. "Why do you do it?" he asked. "Because someone must," she replied without theater. "Because it is shameful that a city eats a child for lack of courage from its rulers. I do not pretend that I change the world. I mend the edges so it does not bleed beyond the seams." Lin Sanqi allowed himself a small smile. "You mend edges well." She looked at him then, and for a moment her secret thought, the one she guarded like a bright coin, slid out. Only the Rita heard it. Only the night mocked it. "I will be seen, not because I demand it, but because I will make them need me." Lin Sanqi took a breath and, against his usual caution, did something small and dangerous. "Come to the hall next week," he said quietly. "I will introduce you as a witness about the kitchen." Sanqi blinked. The offer was dangerous because it put her where men like Pan Yang could touch her, and where the court could decide to make an example. It was dangerous because the hall does not forgive small hands that are too ready with truth. But when you have stitched the hems of a broken cloak for long enough, you learn that risk is a kind of needle. She accepted. The days that followed were a spiral of small, tight preparations. Sanqi sewed a new pocket into her sleeve to hide the midwife's token. She stitched it so close to her skin that only a false thing could tear it free. She practiced, when alone, the cadence of speech she would use. Plain words, not pleading. She practiced not to cry, because tears in courts have a way of being read as theatrics. Pan Yang noticed. Of course, he basically arranged for a servant to spill that the prince planned to look favorably on the witness. Rumor became a blade polished for immediate use. He began to whisper to men who had hungry memories, to those who still owed him favors. He purchased the loyalty of a few low magistrates, and nudged them to doubt the merits of a woman with a worn token. When the day came, the hall was full of that kind of courtly attention that smells like roasted meat and the powder of papers. The magistrate sat like a fat insect upon a cushion. Lin Zhongyi introduced Sanqi, not as a supplicant but as a person who had seen the truth of the kitchen. She will speak plainly, he said. Sanqi stepped forward. Her skirt rustled like a small river. She felt the midwife's token warm against her breast. When she spoke, it was like striking a bell in the dark. She spoke of cups, and men, and ledgers. She spoke about the night, and about the man who had smiled too often in the doorway. She spoke about refugees who had been promised more than they were given. Her voice was simple and precise. When she mentioned the sachet she had found near a Ligera scrap of the Prime Minister's household, the court rustled. Pan Yang's fingers tightened on his fan. You accuse a noble family? Someone asked. The question sharp as an oyster shell. I accuse the acts I saw, Sanqi replied. The rest is for this court to decide. There was a pause as the room considered a small woman who named things they preferred unnamed. It was in that pause that the prince, who had been seated in the shade with the expression of a man half reading, leaned forward. His eyes met Sanqi's and, across a room of scheming, something like compassion and calculation intersected. He did not speak. He did not have to. The court took his look as counsel. Lin Zhongyi watched the prince then, and in his heart a line settled. He had not come to court to make friends, he had come to make proper decisions. He saw that the prince's silence was a kind of shield, and a kind of verdict. He also saw that a man who watched could, if he chose, turn a glance into protection. After the hearing, Sanqi walked out into the cold and found someone had left a small cloth by the brazier. A black fan that smelled faintly of camphor in the palace. The fan had no signature. Her fingers closed around it, and, for a moment, she thought of the prince, of the impossibility of a life where a man might choose to be her champion. She thought of the midwife's token too. She did not know yet the shape of the future. She only felt the motion of fate, like a low tide pulling the sand beneath her feet. That evening, as the palace lamps blinked, and the prince read by the window, a courier arrived with a sealed note. The prince read, and the lines of his face changed. He paced once, then twice. He considered not only the political calculus how a noble family's disgrace would rouse the prime minister, and how Pan Yang's wrath might turn to other targets, but also the human shape of the accusation. A small woman who tended the wounded, while others tended their reputations. He placed the note aside, lifted his chin, and decided, in equal parts compassion and strategy, to observe further. Some choices are private before they are public. The prince's choice that night was to keep watching. He sent a quiet order that the kitchen ledgers be audited, and that food rations be accounted for. He sent a hand to Lin Zhongyi, with a phrase, more for instruction than for kindness. Do not let politics crowd justice. Lin Zhongyi bowed and left. But before he did, he paused, and looked at the prince as if seeing him naked of titles for a moment. If she is guilty, he said, the law will find her. If she is innocent, she will be free to mend. The prince's mouth tightened. If she is innocent, he replied, then perhaps I have seen a wrong I can right. That reply, unintentionally, carried a weight beyond policy. On the streets, some men would say, the prince was soft. In the halls, some would call his hesitance ruinous. Both were true, to a degree. The prince had learned that to rule was to choose the lesser of many wrongs, but there are moments when a man chooses to bear a wrong for the possibility of a right. Sanqi did not know yet that such a bearing had begun. That night, as she folded her own thin blanket, Lin Sanqi turned the midwife's token between her fingers. A memory flickered through her of a white river stone, and a woman who had told her, in a voice like dried grass, remember the river mark. She traced, unconsciously, the crescent beneath her ear. With the pad of her thumb, the mark was pale and small, but it thrummed like a cryptic signature. She kept it as a private proof that some other story might be woven into hers. In the background of the city's sleeping breath, Pan Yang moved like a dark tide. He felt thwarted by the prince's quiet maneuvers, and resentful of the attention a low-born woman was receiving. He decided then to escalate, not by proof, but by spectacle. He would manufacture a new scandal that could not be unstitched by ledger or witness. He began to plan a performance, something that would put Sanqi in a place from which she could not easily return, where the court's appetite for spectacle would devour the truth. His first act was small. He hired a group of men to plant a forged note in the quarters where Sanqi slept, a note with a line in the handwriting of a midwife who had long since died. The note suggested a claim that Sanqi was not only meddling but that she carried an old family secret. It said, in a hand meant to mimic a dead mouth, that a river-bound birth had been hidden and that an infant had been moved for reasons of state. It was a fragment, a splinter of noise meant to be shoved under the doors and watched as the flames of gossip ate it. Pan Yang's plan counted on the court to prefer Taidi's stories. If someone could claim a secret lineage, then a woman's presence could be framed as an incident of sedition rather than compassion. Pan Yang was cunning enough to know that courts believe in flags and fathers far more than they believe in small acts of mercy. When Lin Zhongyi heard of the planted note, he bristled. He understood forgery the way a butcher understands blade. There are marks on a hand that cannot be truly copied. He returned to the ledgers, to the kitchen boy, to the charcoal marks on Pan Yang's clerk's palms. He stitched facts together with patience. He could not yet know who would win the narrative. Sanqi, for her part, felt the air thickening. People looked at her as if she were a coin that might be spent for any purpose. That afternoon, a child she had once sewed a coat for ran to her with eyes full of a new kind of fear. They say you're a secret? The child breathed. They say you're the prince's shadow. They say you took a baby. Sanqi knelt and smoothed the child's hair. She felt, in that image of herself as a thief of children, a rage, not born of vanity, but of pure practical protection. She had never stolen a child. Her life had been the opposite. She had sewn lives together with thread where men had cut. Her inner thought sharp now, and bright said, if they will make me a story, I will make myself a necessary chapter. That night, the prince sat alone in his study and watched the moon run a slow course across the rice paper window. He was a young man with a crown in waiting and a terrible taste for the truth. He wondered, quietly, and with a kind of childlike curiosity, what would become of a woman who loved the edges of a world, while others loved the center? If she was guilty, the law should fall on her without mercy. If she was innocent, the law should hold the guilty to account. The question was not merely legal, it was moral, and the prince found himself unreasonably tangled in its threads. He had not decided then to defy the court, or to throw his weight either way. He had decided, for now, to watch, and to weigh, and to place his attention where policy so often refused to look. It was a choice that seemed small in the lantern light, but would ripple outward. In the end, the night closed with a few truths and many speculations. Lin Sanqi lay on a thin pallet, the midwife's token at her throat like a heart, she thought quietly, with the kind of poetry that comes from anger and love inhabit they. Call me nothing. I will be the notice they cannot afford. She fell asleep on that small, stubborn note. Above her, in a palace that pretended to be blind to small sufferings, the prince raised his cup and drank the bitter tea someone had left for her. It warmed his hands, he set his jaw, and resolved to remain a spectator, who acts when necessary. The trouble was that spectatorship is always a negotiation between cowardice and courage. He would have to decide, soon, if the secret inside the unappreciated wife was a truth that would demand his name. A summons arrived 2 days later. It was slender, not ostentatious, bearing the prince's seal. Lin Sanqi read the lines with the slow, curious restraint of someone who had been invited to a place where invitations mean something else. The seal was not a promise. It was an attention. She folded the note into the pocket she had sewn inside her sleeve, next to the midwife's token, and felt the two things touch like bones. As she walked toward the palace gate that afternoon, the city seemed to hush. The refugees, who had come to expect small kindnesses and large indifference, followed the tail of her shadow with eyes like question marks. Lin Zhongyi met her at the gate briefly. Speak plainly, he said, the man who balanced justice and mercy with a steady hand. I will speak, she replied, but not in the way they expect. At the threshold of the prince's court, the guards paused, looking at her rough hands and the token at her throat. The palace was a place for theater. To be called there was to appear on a stage whose lights burned mercilessly. Sanqi entered not as the heroine of a chronicle, but as a woman who had been called to testify about the world. Inside, in a room smelling of sandalwood and paper, the prince waited. He rose when she entered, the posture of a man who recognizes the humblest of truths in the face of the proudest of lies. His eyes were quiet. The same ember of curiosity glowed in them. He bowed with a decorous gravity that made Sanqi think, for a moment, of the way a mountain bows to the first rain. Slow, inevitable, and strangely intimate. You have been busy, he said. It was not a question. I have been busy, she answered, the secret she held small, luminously between them, like a small animal. She had always kept it for reasons she did not yet fully understand. A private longing, or a proof, or an oath made to a midwife, who had held her when the river's water, had run cold and steady. The memory finished like a sentence within her. The midwife's hands had cupped a child, and hummed a lullaby that Sanqi now could not forget. The midwife had said, the river keeps secrets, but sometimes the river lends you a key. Sanqi pressed the token warmer against her chest, and let the memory fold into the present. The prince watched her, and for a moment the palace walls did not feel like walls but like the edges of a bowl cupping something small and fragile. You keep an odd company, he said finally, with the quiet humor that could make a man seem more forgiving than the law itself. I keep the company of hunger, she replied. It speaks less than most, but it is honest. He considered this. The candlelight carved his jaw into planes. You spoke plainly in court. I did not speak for myself. She glanced down, thumb worrying the thread at her sleeve. I spoke for those who cannot stand in halls like this. He watched her fingers. There was an undercurrent in his stomach, an old hollow filled suddenly with the sound of a child's small voice. He had never been moved by speeches that swelled like ropes. He was moved now by the literalness of a woman who knew the names of herbs and the names of children. It was a private kind of awe, one that made him want first to shield and then to learn. I will ask you one question, he said. Is it true that you once tended a child near the river? A child, hidden, during a riot. Sanqi startled at the sharpness of the question. Her mouth opened and closed, without sound. For a moment she considered evasion. Her life had trained her in it, but something in the prince's face made lying pointless. He was not an accuser tonight. He was a man trying to place pieces. Yes, she said. I wrapped him in old cloth, and watched until he slept. The prince's hand left the paper he had been reading. He looked as though he had remembered a taste. I was that child, he said quietly. The room soft around Sanqi like a sky after rain. Her palms went cold. A rush of small images draw under a bed, the particular smell of starch, a small hand slipping a coin into a child's fist, passed through her mind like fish. The thought she had sheltered for months. If they will make me a story, I will make myself a necessary chapter. Popped like a pin in a wet room. She had loved the edges. The prince, she realized, carried one of those edges inside him too. He rose, moving from the formality of his seat into something closer, more human. You saved me, he said. The words were not triumphal. They were like a confession, and a debt both. You cannot know how that fact has lived inside me. Perhaps that is selfish. But I must know. Did you ever think of me as more than a child? Sanqi's inner voice, the private ledger she kept for herself, had been a mixture of mischief and something softer. She had thought the prince might one day look and see. She had thought, when the moon sharpened the palace tiles, of a life where the man who observed could meet the eyes of the woman who tended. She had never planned a throne. She had planned usefulness, recognition that mended lives. And if she was honest now, even to herself, a wish that the man who watched would learn to measure people by their deeds. She looked at the prince and, in a tiny movement that felt like plucking an instrument string, let the most dangerous thing she owned slip out. I thought of you when I held a child by the river, she said. And sometimes when I could not sleep, I thought of being seen by you as one person sees another, not as a rumor or a lesson to be learned, but as a woman. That is my secret. Silence lay between them. The prince's face was a map of conflicting impulses. He had power. He had a court that lived by image and rumor. He had an entire network of men whose interests would bite at any sign of tenderness. He also had a past that had been rescued by her hands. He reached out, not to seize, but to close the distance between a patron and a person. You are reckless with your truth, he said, and that makes you dangerous. Not always to others for that. I would rather see you dangerous to the complacent, but to yourself. His hand hovered near the token at her throat, the gesture that would have been intimate in any other setting. He did not touch her. Instead, he gave her a look that combined promise and warning. There are many who will make a story of you in ways neither of us would like. I cannot, by law, make your life whatever I desire. I can, however, make space for the truth to come to light, to be heard without being devoured by spectacle. Will you trust me to do that? Sanqi felt the spinning of the court, 1,000 tiny decisions, moving like a loom run through her mind. Her inner thought, small and stubborn, answered first. They call me nothing. I will be the notice they cannot afford. Then. She looked at the prince and, because a heavier truth had entered the room, she answered aloud. I will trust you, she said. He nodded. Then tell me everything that matters, not in whispers but in chronology. Names. Ledgers. The kitchen boys, who can be found sobbing in corners. If you will be a witness, I will make a place where witnesses are heard. They talked until the lantern gutters burned low. Lin Sanqi, who had been asked to remain nearby, listened in the shadowed doorway and plotted careful steps like a man mapping a river's bends. He understood strategy. He also understood courage when he saw it. Sanqi's words were small, granular things. Dates, bribes, a name here, a ledger line there. They were not sensational. They were true. Pan Yang did not wait long to answer. Men like him are not patient with silence, they prefer to shape it. He moved with the arrogance of a man used to arranging spectacles. First, he whispered to a clerk, then to a mid-level steward, then to a disgraced scribe who harbored a grudge. He purchased little alliances. A cup for a clerk, the promise of a small favor to a magistrate. Then he produced what he thought would be irrevocable. A woman in a borrowed robe, and a false letter, both meant to make Sanqi into a narrative that would not withstand close light. It was a trap set with taste. The borrowed robe bore a sigil that, to a casual glance, might have belonged to a minor branch of the palace. The woman who wore it had been coached to speak with a midwife's cadence, and to carry a small token on imitation of the blue scrap Sanqi held. Pan Yang's plan was twofold: to produce theater, and to fill the court's appetite for tidy stories. If Sanqi could be shown as someone coveting a hidden lineage, then the court would prefer the spectacle of her unworth rather than the discomfort of investigating high-ranked men. The day the trap unfolded, the weather matched the mood. A flat, gray sky that leaned on the palace like the edge of a blade. The corridors smelled of old paper and wet stone. The woman in the borrowed robe was led through the halls like a stage piece. She entered the antechamber with the confidence of someone who had practiced distress. "Your Highness," she declared when brought before the prince. "This woman Lin Sanqi was part of a secret crossing. I have a note signed by a midwife who claimed the child to be moved because of shame. I know where the river mark comes from. She wishes to step into a line she does not belong to." There was an immediate reaction. The first puff of a gale. Whispers. Stares like knives. The crowd in the room split into tides of judgment and curiosity. Pan Yang, who watched from the shade, like a man content with his drawing, smiled, the smile of someone who expected the tide to obey him. Sanqi felt the room tilt. She had not been presented with this woman before. She had not expected such overt spectacle. For a moment, the old fear, the kind that makes a person small, arrived in her chest. But Lin Zhongyi was already moving. He requested the notes be read. He directed the clerk to the midwife who had supposedly written the declaration. He demanded the scribe's register. His voice was precise. The voice of someone who believed process could be armor. Pan Yang's allies produced documents. The court relished drama. A magistrate half rose to the needle of the spectacle, hungry for the clarity of ruin. The prince's face, however, was unreadable. He had seen a child hidden at the edge of a riot. He had seen mercy born of necessity. He also recognized the craftiness of men who bend truth for ambition. Lin Zhongyi's inquiries were like a patient surgeon's. He asked the obvious and the absurd: who delivered the robe, who purchased the thread, who signed the letter. He had his own network of small favors and stubborn facts. A clerk remembered that a ledger had been altered. A servant recalled a night when Pan Yang had lingered near the quarters of a lowly midwife. A scribe had a habit of adding a thin line to a signature when a coin had been slipped. As the details piled, a quieter contest began. Pan Yang's evidence looked heavier at first, because it was designed to be spectacle. Yet the seamstress who had supposedly made the robe, a small woman who sold silk by the river, testified that she had not woven the particular pattern on the collar in decades. A thread type used in Pan Yang's robe was cheaper than palace thread. The note, when studied by a real midwife brought in by Lin Zhongyi, used phrases that the real midwives would never have chosen. The spices mentioned were wrong for the region. A clerk from Pan Yang's household made an error in a ledger line that matched a bribe recorded in a tavern. The web showed 1 week, not after another. Then, at the height of spectacle, an unexpected and perilous twist occurred. A young woman, a servant in the Prime Minister's house, stepped forward, trembling. She claimed to have been paid to place the false note in Sanqi's quarters. Her confession was not dramatic. It trembled like a thread about to be cut. She spoke of a coin, of a man with a buttoned sleeve, who had promised promotion. In that moment, Pan Yang's smile faltered. Pan Yang retaliated with what men like him always choose: outrage and diversion. He demanded the court call witnesses for the robe's origin. He called in an old woman, who claimed Sanqi's token was a mark of heritage. The old woman's voice was loud and full of rumor. She had no proof, but she had spectacle. The trial tilted back and forth. Pan Yang's men shouted. Lin Zhongyi's questions cut through noise like a blade. Sanqi stood and listened. Her thoughts moved like lightning, quick, direct. Asterisk. If they make me a story, I will be what I choose. If they choose me, let them choose the truth. Asterisk. She had no taste for martyrdom, only for justice. When the magistrate prepared to give a preliminary order, an order that might mean her confinement, pending further investigation, something small and sharp occurred. A footman, in the antechamber, one of those usually invisible men, who polished the edges of spectacle, rushed forward and presented a scrap of cloth salvaged from the midwife's own hut. The scrap bore a stitch that matched the token's fabric and the particular pattern of a name stitched into its Ija stitch technique, common only among midwives from a single village by the river. Lin Zhongyi took the scrap and compared it to the token Sanqi had tucked by her breast. They fit like two halves of a coin. That token was not stolen, he said, voice level. It was given. Pan Yang's face, tension in it now, was a study in someone who had overplayed his hand. He lashed out verbally, but the court had begun to notice the way his men shifted uneasily. The prince watched the exchange, and the room understood that his interest had moved beyond mere curiosity. He was now, by dint of his attention, a counterbalance. Yet even as the truth found purchase, the stakes rose. The prince knew the court's appetite for narrative. He also knew that public displays of mercy could flare into suspicion. There were voices that would say he was soft for sparing a lowly woman, or that he was playing favorites. The prime minister's household would not forgive an insult lightly. The risk was political and real. The magistrate, in a gesture that would be read differently by different ears, declared a stay on any immediate punitive measure. He ordered an official audit of the granaries, and a public account of the ledgers in question. He scheduled a full hearing with witnesses sworn and letter samples compared. The crowd dispersed with the slow hunger of people who trade in rumors. The day after the antechamber drama, Pan Yang acted with the sort of cruelty that leaves scars not visible. He sent a man to brush a hand against Sanqi in a crowded corridor, a hand that would seem accidental and be reported as harassment by the woman who had been habituated to taking humiliation quietly. That evening a rumor bloomed that Sanqi had accepted gifts from men. The rumor spread like mold. It would, Pan Yang hoped, make Sanqi look like someone who took advantage of soldiers and men of rank. This was the moment in which Lin Zhongyi's moral backbone hardened into something like law. He had seen enough to know that the slow, patient assembling of facts mattered more than the sword's theatrics. He had also seen that men like Pan Yang made a living by getting ahead of processes with panic. He used both the law and the theater of the law. He placed men to watch Pan Yang's clerk, shadowed the ledger entries, and took testimony from those who feared telling the truth for lack of favor. Pan Yang, when finally confronted with the clerk who paid a servant to plant the note, stumbled under the weight of his own allies' betrayals. The clerk spoke with a voice whose edges had been sanded by fear. He spoke of a hand and a coin and a date. He had not intended truth to come so cleanly. Pan Yang, faced now with specific witnesses and the matching of a ledger line to a bribe recorded at a tavern, found his usual defenses inadequate. The official hearing was a theater of restraint. The prince sat as an observer, and occasionally spoke in tones that the court could not mistake for mere curiosity. He ordered certain testimonies be noted, and certain ledgers be called to the floor. His interventions were narrow and judicial. He knew political theater would only inflame his enemies. Still, one could not mistake the direction of his temper. He wanted justice to be done without spectacle, but Spectacle was what he had to navigate. And then came the most dangerous, dramatic turn. An impersonation meant to provoke a riot. Late one night, Pan Yang arranged for a group of men to parade a woman through a market, claiming she was a lost cousin of a minor consort, someone who would, by implication, have claim to some land or favor. The crowd, eager for a story, followed. The idea was to force an informal trial in the streets, to make the court look powerless. Word slipped into the night like knives. "She wears the token," said one. "She has the river mart," said another. Sanqi, who had learned to gauge danger by the way people's feet shifted, heard of the procession, and moved among the crowds. She walked toward the noise because people will always move toward the things that repel them most. She found the woman in the borrowed robe standing on a cart. A stage for rumor. The crowd wanted spectacle. Pan Yang wanted a spark. Sanqi's approach cut through the tumult. Like a needle, she climbed the cart and faced the woman. The market was full of faces lit by lanterns and curiosity. Sanqi's voice found itself loud but not unkind. "Who are you?" she demanded. The woman's eyes flicked to the token at Sanqi's throat and then away. She faltered. A merchant spat the price of a gossip at the woman. The woman's voice, coached and brittle, answered with the tale Pan Yang had rehearsed. Sanqi listened, and when the woman finished, she said, simply, "You were paid to say that." The crowd hissed. The cart rocked. Whoever had paid the woman to lie had not counted on a small woman with the habit of looking close to the seam. The market began to do the one thing that terrifies manipulators: question their assumption of certainty. People remembered the patient hands that brought soup and sewed pockets. A man who had once been given bread by Sanqi suddenly spoke, and his voice steadied the rumor into a confession. By the time the magistrate's men arrived, the market had revealed a truth Pan Yang had sought to hide. The woman in the borrowed robe recanted when offered bread and a chance to speak openly. She spoke of a coin and a knight, and a man with a buttoned sleeve. The cart became evidence. Pan Yang's campaign had overreached. Once a man's methods are exposed as theatrical, his allies began to shrink under scrutiny. That was when Lin Sanqi moved in a way that would be remembered by those who liked the law for its own sake. He assembled witnesses who testified to ledger entries. He matched the handwriting of the forged note to a clerk in the Prime Minister's house, who had been known to copy letters for money. He produced receipts, the smallest of things, and made them speak. Cornered, Pan Yang lashed out not with blades, but with the only thing a man of his class had left: language. He accused Lin Sanqi of collusion, of siding with low-born women, to undermine noble lines. That was the sort of accusation that would make a court deliberate. It forced the prince to stand, finally, not as passive observer but as a man who must decide what his court would tolerate. The prince's reply was not rhetorical. He ordered a formal investigation into financial irregularities, and demanded the prime minister account for the use of state funds in his household. He pronounced, in a tone both careful and final, that if any man used public funds to purchase lies, they would not be protected by rank. The palace felt the tremor. The prince had, by law, the capacity to order investigations. He used it. Pan Yang was brought before a hearing that had the look of ritual, the shedding of pretense. He was stripped of certain privileges, no titles, no seat at certain councils, and placed under supervised house arrest while a formal inquiry took place. The action was surgical. It did not end in blood. The court could not afford a bloodletting public enough to set factions on fire. Pan Yang, a man whose appetite had been fed by privilege, tasted the blandness of restriction, and seethed. As for Sanqi, the consequences were more complicated. The court, advised by the prince, and guided by Lin Sanqi's evidence, publicly exonerated her of the forged notes. The magistrate announced that an inquiry had found irregularities in the Prime Minister's household, and that certain servants had been bribed to spread falsehoods. It was an elegant turning of the tide. The public declaration spared Sanqi from the worst of rumor, but the court is an animal that remembers in different ways. Some would always smirk and say she had once been in the antechamber. Others would note her courage. The prince's reaction on that public day was a mixture of restraint and tenderness. He stood beside Sanqi as the magistrate read the decision. He did not, in the crisp protocol of court, take her by the hand or call her by a private name. He offered, instead, a public measure that would have immediate, practical effect. He issued a decree that a portion of the palace's granary accounts be audited and reallocated to support refugee relief. He named Lin Sanqi to oversee the audit and to administer a new office that would supply medical aid and rations to the neighborhoods Sanqi had been tending. To correct what was misallocated, he said in the hall, voice steady, is to mend the fabric of our realm. He watched the face of the Prime Minister's household when the words landed. They were not pleased, but the prince had fashioned his action as policy more than as favor. He had given Sanqi a shield without turning their private history into a public spectacle. It was judicially neat. It was, in its own way, an intimate act. Sanqi's inner thought, which had been secret and sharp, now unreeled in a different tone. He protects the wound without making it his own. She had desired his notice. His response was not the immediate turning of love into proclamation that her private heart had sometimes sketched in dim hope. Instead, he used his power in a way that would create rooms where her work could continue safely. It was not the form of love she had imagined at times, a private pledge, a hand under the table, but it was a larger sort of recognition, the kind that might change lives. There was still a private scene that had to be faced. In the quiet that followed the public declaration, the prince asked to speak with Sanqi alone. They walked in the palace garden, where the winter had not yet surrendered to spring. The air smelled of damp stone and the thin green of shoots. He spoke with the careful cadence of a man who prized truth, but feared to make hasty promises. You asked me once to protect the truth, he began. I have tried to do that. I know, Sanqi said. Her answer was not a plea for more. It was a recognition of what had been given and what had been refused. He hesitated, then added, You told me your secret, the thought you kept. You said you wanted to be seen. You asked for it not as a demand but as a necessity. Sanqi felt the rawness in her chest bend into something like peace. I asked to be necessary, she said. I wanted people to need the work I do. To be seen is not always to be loved. It is sometimes only to be needed. The prince looked at the flowers pushing through frost. I will not make you a story from my court, he said. I will not declare what is private to satisfy anyone's hunger for romance, but I will shelter your work. I will ensure the new office Lin Sanqi heads is empowered. I will sign decrees to open granaries and protect those who defy their superiors. To tell the truth, he stopped as if the words themselves could bruise them both. There are limits to what I may do without undoing other goods, but there is also something I can do that is steady and true. I can stand by justice when it is needed, and I can stand by you in ways that will not make your life small. Sanqi measured his meaning. A different possibility had been offered. Not the private wedlock that some nights had visited her thoughts, but a political partnership that would use the prince's office to institutionalize compassion. It was not the fairy tale recognition she might once have entertained. It was, perhaps, a deeper currency. Structural change. What do you ask of me? She asked. Truth, he said. And patience. Help me make institutions that survive the whims of men like Pan Yang. Help me hold a court that values the small hands that stitch our edges. Will you join me in that? Not as a consort, or as a pawn, but as a steward of the city's margins. Sanqi's private thought *, they call me nothing. *Naut had a different shape. to be necessary, rather than merely seen. She could have chosen exile, or an ascent to a status that might have made her a target. She chose instead the possibility of making the lives she loved better for many. It was, in its way, a kind of love returned, not the immediate clasp of bodies, but the long, slow weaving of common good. "I will join you," she said. The words were measured. She felt Lin Zhongyi's principles humming quietly somewhere in the background. She felt the midwife's token warm again against her chest. The prince reached out and briefly gently took her hand. It was not a pledge of romance for the court to feast on. It was a human touch, a promise of collaboration, and a private recognition of the debt he carried, because of the child he once was. Pan Yang's days in power dwindled. The inquiry unearthed the kind of petty cruelties and briberies that look ugly under daylight. A stable expense paid for a hunting leash, a ledger line of rice that could not be accounted for, promises made to soldiers that were not kept. He was not executed. He was stripped of rank and sent away from the capital to an administrative post of humiliation. The prime minister, whose household had been implicated, was forced into a ceremonial apology and to resign a position of influence. The court breathed differently. Teresa, the stepsister, who had once thrust Sanqi into scandal, found her place shrinking. The family's ambitions, ill-placed and brittle, had less traction when the prince's favor shifted toward transparent governance. She was married, as many women of her type were, to a lesser official in the It was a respectable exile. Sanqi watched the steps of her former house become less imposing as the season turned. Lin Zhongyi's role grew in a way that suited him. Given authority to head the new office, he created a small team with both legal muscle and compassion. Midwives, clerks honest enough to keep ledgers, and men and women from the market who knew the city's true geography. He had no taste for glory. He had a taste for work that didn't allow for the rod of bribery. The prince's decree gave him tools. Sanqi gave him the moral clarity. As months passed, the granaries were opened for proper accounting. Refugee quarters that had once been invisible were catalogued. A small hospital built from old palace rooms and new charity began to tend to the fevers that had once taken children. Women Sanqi had taught gathered to form clinics. Where the prince's hand could not reach directly, Sanqi's continued presence mended threads. She led without title at first and then, by degrees, with the modest name of Matron of Relief, a role that allowed her to redistribute funds and to decide on the appointment of field workers who would be free from predatory men. Her status changed publicly, but her life did not become theater. She continued to wear her simple clothes in the quarters she preferred. The prince was seen sometimes in the governor's office, watching the distribution of grain, with a face made private by his attention. Their encounters were careful, ritualized, by purpose, rather than by passion. Men in the court whispered different things. Rumor that she was a favorite, that she was a meddler, that she had risen too far. None of them had the full truth. One evening in the spring, after the new office had distributed seeds to a district that had suffered 3 lean winters, Sanqi walked alone along the riverbank. The midwife's token rested like a warm pebble against her ribs. The prince came out of the shadow of the trees, his cloak damp from the river's breath. He had come without a retinue. He walked toward her as a man walking toward another human. Not as a sovereign approaching a subject. "You have made many things possible," he said. "Men in houses of power speak of you with an odd admiration, as if you performed some miracle. I know it is not miracle. It is hard work." Sanqi shook her head. "It is messy, and bloodless, and patient. It is what a city asks to survive." He paused, then asked the question that had come to him slowly over months. "And your secret, what do you want from it now?" "To be seen. To be a story." Her inner voice, once sharp and defensive, had softened into a deeper claim. To be necessary, to make them need me, so that they cannot forget. Asterisk. She gave him the answer that had been forming while they built a structure together. I want the work, she said. I want those children to be alive because someone has a ledger that cannot be bought. I want the midwife's token to be a map, not a talisman. I want the prince to be free to rule with the truth at his back rather than rumor. If being seen by you helps that happen, I will accept it in the ways that do good. The prince looked at her, and whatever he felt, surprise, tenderness, restraint, settled into a look of deep respect. He reached out, and this time touched the token over her heart, not as an owner, but as a man acknowledging a debt. Then let us continue together, he said, not by making you a prize, but by making this place less hungry for lies. She put her hand over his, for a moment, feeling the warmth of a man who could have given an immediate, reckless answer, but chose the steadier, more dangerous path of structural change. The months that followed were not a neat storybook ascension. There were new challenges. Men who attempted to reinsert bribes into old channels, governors who misreported grain, and a few small uprisings in places that had lost more than words could count. But the presence of a new office and a prudent prince made them less easily hidden. Sanqi's reputation shifted in the city. She was still sometimes called the stepdaughter, as the habits of speech take a generation to die. But in the market, and in the clinics, mothers told their children of the woman who sewed pockets into coats to keep bread safe. Children, who had once wasted at winter, received boiled broth. The city continued to be complicated, but the edge it bled from became less ragged. Pan Yang, now stripped of the trappings of power, sat in a provincial office, writing reports that no one read. He had lost the ability to direct rumor. The Prime Minister had retreated to a house with fewer friends. Those who had gambled on their ability to manipulate justice found fewer partners willing to risk the prince's displeasure. As for Lin Sanqi, he continued to walk the line between law and mercy. He became known for a certain dry humor that relieved tense councils. He and Sanqi kept a friendship that was sometimes mistaken for something softer. He never forgot the nights when law was the only shield and when a woman's knowledge of herbs saved a man's life. That memory held him steady. Years later, when the story was told in kitchens and in halls, it was not only the romance that gathered the most votes. People remembered that when the siege of hunger came, a small woman kept a ledger of compassion, and a prince who had been a hidden chauchas, with the slow courage of people who have been saved. To protect that ledger, they would tell the tale in fragments. He spared her. He elevated her. He loved her in a way that did not satisfy prurient needs, but changed public policy. It was, those who cared for facts said, a better story. On a quiet day, long after the noise had waned, Sanqi stood in a new clinic, and watched a child test his fingers on a bowl of warm rice. She thought of the midwife's token that had begun so much trouble, and yielded so much fruit. Her inner thought, the one that had once been a simmering defiance asterisk, they call me nothing, asterisk, had softened into something like a quiet, honest account. Asterisk, they cannot afford to forget me now, and I will not let them. Asterisk, the prince, watching from a distance across the courtyard, caught her eye, and lifted his hand in a small salute. It was private and public at once. How did he react to her hidden thoughts? He reacted like a man who had been rescued by a secret. He turned that debt into policy and protection. He did not make pronouncements of romantic rescue in the court's sensational ways. He offered her a shield that worked. Legal reforms, a staffed office, and the quiet of an agreement not to reduce her two-story. Privately, he gave her respect and a small, guarded tenderness. Politically, he gave her safeguards that would allow her to keep doing what she had always done: mend the edges. If the answer must be measured in two parts, emotional and political, then it is this. Emotionally, the prince felt a protectiveness, born of gratitude, and a complicated tenderness. Politically, he converted that feeling into something structural, using his authority to spare her from spectacle, and to create an office that turned compassion into policy. He balanced heart and state with the caution of a man who knew that both, when misused, could hurt. In the end, Lin Sanqi's secret was no longer merely the private longing she had kept at night. It became a lever for the public good. The world she wanted to be necessary in now needed her, and the prince's reaction was to ensure that necessity had the force of law. That was the answer the palace would not print in gossip sheets, but the city would feel in bellies that did not hunger, and in children who slept with the sound of soup simmering in the next room. The last image is not of a crown or a bedchamber, but of a small clinic window where, through steam and light, a pair of hands, one rough from sewing, the other steady with princely habit, pass a bowl across a table. No grand declarations are made. A quiet settlement unfolds. A man who wages power with conscience, and a woman who, when deemed nothing, became the necessity the realm could not ignore. If you want to follow how the prince and Lin Sanqi continue to reshape their world, how small mercies become lasting law, subscribe and watch the next chapter of their story.